Everybody wants to know, what is Donald Trump going to do about climate change in his second term in office? I think either it's the worst thing in the world ever, or maybe it's not quite as bad as people think. Everyone knows Donald Trump is a climate skeptic. He doesn't want to act on climate change. He much prefers to have more oil and gas because he thinks that will help the economy. What everyone is very concerned about, though, is a report published by the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing think tank called Project 2025. There's one particular document called Mandate to Lead. It doesn't just want the United States to produce more oil and gas. It wants the United States to dominate the world energy market based on fossil fuels. The next Conservative president should go beyond merely defending America's energy interests, but go on offensive, asserting them around the world. America's vast reserves of oil and natural gas are not an environmental problem. I think they are an environmental problem. They are the lifeblood of economic growth. American dominance of the global energy market would be a good thing for the world, and more importantly for we the people. Full spectrum strategic energy dominance would facilitate the reinvigoration of America's entire industrial and manufacturing sector as we disentangle our economy from China. American dominance of the global energy market. Well, there's another group of people trying to dominate the global energy market. They're called the United Nations. They're trying to decarbonise the world's energy. The United States looks as though it's going to try and base the world's global energy on fossil fuels. In that competition, who do you think is going to win? Remember, the decisions we make in this decade about climate change will decide whether or not our civilization has a survivable future. Later on in the video, we're going to look to see how that competition between the United States and the United Nations is going to play out. The United States are in a good position to win that competition because the United Nations' efforts to decarbonise the world have been going on for so long. There are so many countries who are unhappy with the way it's going. For example, if you're Saudi Arabia, the idea that you might not have to decarbonise, you could carry on selling your oil, might be a good thing. If you're a very poor country that's been expecting money from richer countries to help it cope with the impacts of climate change, to help it transition its energy supply to a zero carbon one, and you feel you're not being treated fairly, maybe the United States will offer you a better vision. In the short term at least, never mind the impacts of climate change will still come, and come probably sooner. Something to keep in mind is how much of what Project 2025 says and what Donald Trump does, how closely are they going to be related? You have to remember that some of the people who worked on the Project 2025 report are now part of Donald Trump's administration. And you need to remember Donald Trump, he's 78 years old. He's had a very stressful year, facing court cases, facing imprisonment, possibly the rest of his life. He's had quite a gruelling campaign to become president. By all accounts, he's worn out. He doesn't have enough energy to govern, so he's going to have to delegate these things to people. The first time Donald Trump was president, the Heritage Foundation produced another one of these reports, and they claim that after 2 years of being in power, Donald Trump had implemented about 2/3 of their ideas. So it's quite possible, possibly likely, that these ideas Donald Trump will try to put into place, but it's not 100% guaranteed. Possibly because, as you've seen, he might get some pushback from the United States people, and even if it goes ahead, it might not get the results he's hoping for. So anyway, first of all though, let's look to see how it might affect the United States directly, because I think it might not be quite as serious as people think. First of all, Donald Trump may want to increase United States production of oil and gas, but so did Joe Biden. Here's a chart showing how oil production increased during Donald Trump's time, but it still increased about the same rate during Joe Biden's time, and that's partly because of the war in Ukraine. They didn't want Europe to survive on Russian gas, so the United States built an awful lot of liquid natural gas infrastructure to allow them to export it. A wave of new liquid natural gas export capacity is under construction, which has the potential to create a surplus of supply in global gas markets. Downside pressure on natural gas prices could arise from the additional supply, which could make liquid natural gas more attractive for industry, incentivising coal to gas switching. Lower natural gas prices also reduce the attractiveness of consumers for switching from gas boilers to heat pumps, which could potentially delay the uptake of this more efficient form of heating. So for years to come, the war in Ukraine, the United States' response to that war in Ukraine, could mean our attempts to tackle climate change have been compromised. And you might think, well, surely natural gas is more carbon friendly than coal. Well, according to this report, it says liquid natural gas is more damaging to the environment than coal itself. You might think Donald Trump's coming, it's all going to change. It's quite possible it will all carry on the same, because Joe Biden wasn't that much better. The one thing, though, that Joe Biden did, the previous president, was the Inflation Reduction Act. It's an attempt to help the United States transition away from fossil fuels to a zero carbon economy. It had a lot of money to pay for infrastructure and tax breaks for companies to become more zero carbon friendly. 85% of all the money that's been released through the Inflation Reduction Act has gone to areas that are thought to be Republican, who support Donald Trump. Also, big oil companies have been receiving tax credits through the Inflation Reduction Act to pay for things like carbon capture and storage or transition to biofuels. So there's a lot of people on the Republican side who would not want to see the end of the Inflation Reduction Act. That might be a positive thing. Also, the last time Donald Trump was Prime Minister, the last time Donald Trump was President, he removed the United States from the Paris 2015 agreement, the agreement that all the world's countries are working to try and decarbonise their economies. He removed the United States from it. But so many people in the United States still wanted to follow the 2015 Paris Agreement and try and decarbonise their economy, that a group of state senators formed an organisation called the United States Climate Alliance. And those states try and follow the Paris 2015 Agreement, and they account for very roughly about half the United States population. Also, there's something called the dictator's dilemma. And that's the idea that no matter how mad your elected representatives are, no matter that they might replace the top layers of civil servants to have loyalists, sooner or later you're going to need in your system professional, hard-working people who are competent and know what they're doing. So, for example, in 2023, the warmest year on record, the Texas electricity system was only kept going through a heat wave by solar. The Texans had installed so much solar that even though everyone's air conditioning was running full speed, they were still able to keep up. If you work for the Texas Electricity Company, you know how important solar and wind are. You know they're the cheapest form of energy. You probably know these are the future. And there's no point going back to gas and oil because it'd only be a short-term thing. The ship has sailed on whether we should have clean energy or fossil fuel energy. And an important part of this Project 2025 is they do not want government to be top-down telling people how to act. They want the ordinary lower level people, the people who work electricity companies, to decide what's best. Whatever Donald Trump says, whatever Project 2025 says, the United States is a first world country. It will have hard-working professionals who will do a good job. I think that would only have a limited effect. So that's how it might affect the United States directly. But what about the world's efforts to get to a zero-carbon economy? How will they be impacted by some of Donald Trump's potential policies? Well, the whole world is working to the Paris 2015 agreement. Every year they get together somewhere in the world and they discuss progress. There are still, after nearly 10 years, they're still even discussing what it means and what it means in practice. There are two main aspects. Number one, everyone must try and reduce the amount of CO2 they're emitting. So every 5 years they review their nationally determined contributions, and each country is expected to come up with an improved offer and it reduce its CO2 emissions by more than the last time. And also there's an idea in several parts of the agreement that the wealthy countries who are responsible for generating most of the CO2 need to pay money to the poorer countries who are experiencing most of the impacts of climate change, so far at least. And that money is used to help the poorer countries transition to a zero-carbon economy themselves, and also pay for them to be ready for the impacts of climate change. Well, no country is on target with its commitments to reduce CO2. Instead of heading towards 1.5 degrees Celsius of increase in temperatures, as was written down in the Paris 2015 agreement. We're heading for 3 degrees Celsius of warming. And even after 10 years, some of these funding arrangements still aren't complete, and the ones that have started working are still far from satisfactory. The problem is, if you have 196 countries, it's quite difficult to get agreement, and if you think how difficult it is, if you don't want to be on the hook for paying billions or trillions of dollars to a poor country, if you don't want to have to reduce your CO2 emissions by as much as you need to, because in the short term it's much more politically convenient to spend the money other places, then you don't need too much of an excuse to go storming off. You can say, I've been insulted or not treated with respect, or the whole thing is not working. So you have to be so careful in how these things are worked. There are committees that have been meeting for 10 years trying to get agreement on things. One of those tricks they use to try and keep everyone going, because it's so difficult, so at risk of collapse possibly, if the United States offers an alternative energy system for people to be part of, what they do is they sort of live in a world of their own. So, for example, one of their targets is, if we can get to net zero by 2050, then we will be able to keep the increase in temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, let's see what Professor Kevin Anderson has to think about that. He's one of Britain's most respected climate scientists. From the start of 2025, the remaining carbon budget for a 50% chance of not exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius is 170 gigatons of CO2. Between COP28 and COP29, so that's the last year, pretty much the whole of 2024, over 40 gigatons was emitted. Staying within 170 gigatons of CO2 means global cuts in CO2 of 19% year on year starting now. That's completely impossible. But then he goes on to point out what the problem is. They can base it on whatever acronym soup of unicorn messages they want. The physics doesn't give a damn and will keep warming the climate regardless of PR slides, rousing music, nonsense from the IAMs. That stands for Integrated Assessment Models. That's the climate models they use to try and predict the future and work out how much we need to cut our CO2 emissions down. No one has any confidence in them, because they assume all sorts of things that can't really be assumed. They assume the amount of CO2 the oceans and the forests will absorb will continue at the same rate, even though people think it won't. Also, it relies on things called negative emissions technology, which is technology at scale all the way around the world that will extract huge amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere. It doesn't exist in a practical way at the moment. It's unlikely to scale all the way around the world in time. It doesn't matter, as long as the world's governments can say in the future we shall have negative emissions technology, they can carry on as they are. So why do the COP conferences keep assuming if we have zero carbon emissions all the way around the world by 2050, we will still keep to 1.5? Well, it's because the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN part that looks into the climate science, published in 2021 assessment report number 6, and it includes a slide I've used before as well. And it says if we can get to net zero by 2050, we will stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. That's published 3 years ago. The world's moved on since then. And curiously, if you take Professor Anderson's 40 gigatons a year out of a budget of 170 gigatons, that's probably about 4 years worth. It's 2024 now. 2028 will have used up the carbon budget. And mysteriously, on the United Nations graph, on its chart, it says when you get to 2028, we will be at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Have you noticed? The Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. It looks as though we'll have 1.5 degrees Celsius warming by 2028. Some comments on my channel say we're already at 2 degrees Celsius warming, but let's stick to the science. So we start off in 2015 with the Paris Agreement. We're heading for 2028, 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. It's 2024 now. It's nearly 2025. So we're only 3 years away from getting to 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. They're still having meetings and discussing things as though there's no hurry. Let's just have a nice chat, and we'll see you again next year. Find out how well you've done. 10 years along, 3 or 4 years to go. We're going to go zooming past 1.5. They'll still be having meetings. They'll still be publishing PR saying, let's get to net zero by 2050 and we can keep temperatures to 1.5. The trouble is, the people doing negotiations, they're not scientists, they're diplomats. They may or may not have seen that chart. Maybe they've read the synthesis report the United Nations published, the very shorter report for politicians to read. At 3 o'clock in the morning, they won't want you opening up the science again. In fact, it's so complicated. I make videos about this. I can't remember all the fudges and all the things that are included or not included. They've got that document. In some ways, it's a bit academic. They're so far away. We're heading for 3 degrees Celsius of warming. But the most important thing, though, this is the point, the most important thing isn't what actually is going on. The most important thing is what they pretend is going on to allow the world's government to carry on in the COP process. That's the general principle. Let's look at it in detail. In 2024, the COP meeting was held in Baku in Azerbaijan. 90% of Azerbaijan's exports are oil. Possibly that's a country that might like to join the United States' new energy process of saying oil is not an environmental problem, it's a good thing for the economy. Maybe along with Saudi Arabia. Maybe countries are already thinking of leaving. 2025, February, countries need to have declared their new nationally declared contributions, their new estimate for reducing CO2 emissions by 2035. So since COP29 in 2024 is going to be in November, in fact, as making this video on a Friday, it's going to start on the following Monday. This will be something to look out for. If countries want to take the lead, if they want to show they're being ambitious and make a good example to other countries to encourage them to make real commitments that will make a difference, maybe some countries will publish their commitments early. These are the possible nationally determined contribution figures to look out for to see when countries publish them. So, for example, the United Kingdom's been advised by its Committee on Climate Change, the experts who advise the British government on these things. They say you should be able to reduce your CO2 emissions by 81% compared to 1990. So look out in the news to see if the British government announces that. It's a new Labour government. They've only been in 4 or 5 months. They say they want to be more climate friendly, but I can't help noticing they've already authorised the expansion of 2 airports in that time. So watch out to see if the British government is still committed to climate change despite Donald Trump being in office. If they have an 81% commitment to cut emissions compared to 1990 levels, that might be a good sign. The European Union, its targets are a 90% reduction compared to 1990, but only by the year 2040. Their emissions, their commitment to 2030, the old commitments, was 55%. So I think if the European Union commits to cutting its emissions compared to 1990 by 73%, that will be a good sign as well. The United States was in my list. It's not in the list anymore. Curiously though, the United States could have cut its emissions by 65% compared to the year 2005. They go back to 2005. It could have cut its emissions by 65% just by following its existing policies. So if Donald Trump hadn't been president, it's quite possible the United States would have come up with an even bigger target, if they were having the ambition that's needed to get to net zero by 2050. But the one big player who's left, now the United States has left, is China. 5 years ago, the last round of announcements for nationally determined contribution, China said, we will try to peak our emissions by 2030, and then we should try to get to net zero by 2060. Everyone's going to be watching to see what they announce. In theory, they should try for more ambitious targets this time because the technology and the science will have moved on. The theory is, if China offers to cut its emissions compared to 2030, that's going to be their peak. If they can cut their emissions by 2035 compared to what they were 5 years before by 30%, which is a really big number, but China, centrally controlled economy, they can get there if they want to. If they commit to cutting them by 10% compared to what they were in 2030, that would be a good sign. If they only commit, though, to 10%, that would be a bad sign. Last time the United States withdrew from the Paris 2015 agreement, China and everyone slowed down. They took their foot off the pedals. This is what Michael Mann has to say, one of the world's most respected climate scientists. That signalled to other countries like China and India that the US was no longer willing to keep up its end of the bargain, and in turn they slacked off in their own efforts. And he goes on to say how important it is the United States lead, but we shall forget all about that now. The other big carbon producer, the other big economy who might be able to set a standard is India. India is a developing country. It's not a poor country, but there are a lot of poor people there. It's a developing country. It's expecting money, as many other developing countries are, to be able to help it cope with the impacts of climate change and to transition to a zero carbon economy. And it wants $1 trillion. Well, this brings us on to the next part of the video. There are 3 remaining sections of the Paris Agreement that are going to be discussed at COP29 in Baku in Azerbaijan in 2024. They are money to be paid by rich developed countries to developing countries to pay for mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is where a country reduces its emissions, and adaptation is where it prepares for the impacts of climate change. There's money to pay for loss and damage. Loss and damage is more reactive. Mitigation and adaptation is proactive. You spend the money in good time to get best effect. Loss and damage is reactive to emergencies and things like that. And finally, there's some sort of carbon trading scheme. Well, for mitigation and adaptation, nearly 10 years ago it was agreed the money should be paid. It only got to the target of $100 billion a year 2 years ago, so it took the countries a long time to get there. To understand what sort of commitment the wealthy countries need to make, there are 43 countries at the moment who are considered wealthy enough to contribute to the fund. What's curious, Paris 2015 didn't say which countries were included or how you would decide if a country should be included, but they've come up with a list. Britain contributed, of that $100 billion, Britain contributed $1.5 billion. And the way it works is each country just chooses its own projects and hands the money over directly to the people doing that. It doesn't go through the United Nations or anything. There's all sorts of different projects there. If you look through the list, it's a bit dicey how much of them are climate related and how much of them are just good causes, but it's a grant, it's money that's given over. Rory Stewart, who was one time Britain's government minister for foreign aid, he was the one who signed the cheques. He has a concern that the government doesn't spend the money very well, and he gives the example of one project that provided 2 toilets for a school in Africa. Effectively they're just holes in the ground and they're like a basic building around them. He went to see it and he thought it should have cost at the most about $2,000, but the British government paid for the 2 holes in the ground, and he said 5 plastic buckets. He said they paid $40,000, because if the British government's handing out money, it likes to do paperwork, it wants to make sure the money isn't stolen. He said when he got there was a long line of white Land Cruisers. It's a very expensive thing for the British government to give away things, and there are examples. For example, one project in Pakistan, 1/3 of the money was stolen, but that's still better than the British way of doing it, where you just spend all your money on paperwork. How risky, how difficult it is to spend money in developing countries is an important part of what's going to happen. So, and by the way, I think China, everyone says China must give money. China donated each year $5 billion. And China's still a relatively poor country. If you compare it to the United States per person is much more wealthy. The British government pays to foreign aid each year about $15 billion, £15 billion perhaps. And 1/3 of that is spent on asylum seekers in Britain itself, but that still counts as foreign aid. So of the remaining $10 billion, $1.5 billion is spent on climate-related projects. At the moment, there's $100 billion a year is just about being donated. After 10 years, they finally got there. But $100 billion isn't enough for all the developing countries to transition to a zero carbon economy or to get ready for the impacts of climate change. It's thought each year, instead of $100 billion, it should be $6 trillion. That's 60 times as much. Well, 60 times £1.5 billion, £90 billion. That is more than the British government spends on its defence in a year, more than it spends on the army or the air force or the navy. That's not going to happen. This is why countries are so reluctant to get involved in this sort of thing, why it keeps getting pushed down the road. Before it left, well, I know it hasn't left just yet at the time making the video, before the United States left, it suggested $1 trillion a year might be enough. Nobody thought that was enough. But there are ways around it. At the moment, countries are granting the money, they're just giving the money away. It would still meet the terms of the Paris Agreement if instead they made loans and got interest and had the money paid back. Not very popular. Or if they made like commercial investments, if they set up businesses that worked in developing countries that were mitigating or adapting to climate change, and they took a profit, and it would be like self-sustaining. And this, if you can do it that way, this will still count under the rules of the Paris Agreement. If you can do it that way, then you can get private money. And there are so many wealthy people who are so wealthy at the moment. There's something like $200 trillion in the global economy with rich people who would be prepared to invest in the developing countries for mitigation and adaptation, plus another $200 trillion in banks, which effectively would be lending money on behalf of the very wealthiest people. And you might be thinking, well, how that would be enough, but you might be thinking, how are the wealthy people so wealthy that they've got more money than national governments? Well, remember, the very wealthiest people don't pay any tax. Be a wealthy person if you can. But the wealthy people say, we realise how risky it is investing in developed countries. Certainly is, from the British and the Pakistan examples. So they say, we would be happy to invest our money, who can make our commitments, $6 trillion a year easily, but we would want national governments to cover the risk. So if the project's successful, they'll get their money back and interest, fine. If the project is unsuccessful, well, your national government will just cover the loss, so that, they're making money whatever happens. Now, this opens up the idea, without the United States there to provide the money, to take a lead, the other big country who have a reputation for investing overseas and building overseas infrastructure is China. They don't just hand over money, they design the projects, they send their people over to build them. They'll be allowed, under the rules of Paris, they'll be allowed to take a profit and make it a commercial enterprise. So, ironically, the United States, concerned about competing with China, by pulling out of the Paris Agreement, which hasn't done yet, but I'm guessing it will do, it could be opening the door to more influence by China and an opportunity for China to grow its economy even more. What would the European Union do? What would Britain do in that situation? The future of our civilization is at risk. The United States has moved away. China could be still taking on that role of trying to get to net zero by 2050. Are the European Union and Britain going to support China? Is it going to be China and the European Union against the United States? So that's mitigation and adaptation. And by the way, that $6 trillion, that's only for mitigation. There's another budget for adaptation, which is, so adaptation could be 360 billion. That's only a billion. It's a lot of money. Anyway, so that's adaptation and mitigation. Then there's loss and damage. There are 3 types of loss and damage you could suffer. You could suffer something that's avoided. So you've spent money in good time, and maybe the example people give is a warning system, warning of flooding or a heat wave or something like that. So by spending money straight away, you've managed to avoid an extreme weather event that could have killed thousands of people. The next type is unavoided loss and damages. So that's something you could have avoided if you'd thought about it in time, but it's happened. You spend the money afterwards to pay for the impacts. Maybe you learn your lesson and you improve next time. But anyway, that's money for things that could have been avoided but weren't. And then there's this is the most interesting one. There's unavoidable loss and damages. These are things that are coming, you can't do anything about, so you just have to compensate people afterwards. And the example they give is the impacts of glacier melt and sea level rise. Well, the Greenland ice sheet is melting. When it's gone together, sea levels have risen 7 metres. It's quite possible by the 2100 sea level will have risen by 1 metre. That's an awful lot of people you've got to compensate. And, for example, every year From Bangladesh, 300,000 or 400,000 people are made homeless by rising sea levels. Are they going to get any money? No, 70% of them end up living in slums. I'm guessing they don't get the money. So, how much money is this going to cost? It's thought it will be something like $671 billion a year. How much has been raised for this? $700 million, which is 0.1% of what's needed. Can you see, if you're a developing country, if the United States is going to show some leadership, maybe it's going to provide overseas money for developing nations. You know, they haven't been able to get it from through the United Nations scheme, through Paris 2015. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? You know, already Papua New Guinea is not going to go to the COP this year because they say it's not worth it. You know, nothing ever happens. You keep holding out hope to us. How many other countries are in that position? How many other countries would like to sell their fossil fuels to the United States? Then finally, there's a carbon trading system, which I don't really understand. There's two ways it could work. If you have a bilateral agreement, so two countries agree, if one country has reduced its CO2 emissions by so much, it's got plenty of slack compared to its original commitment, then the country that's lagging behind can pay it money. It can take the credit for some of the CO2 emissions cuts the other countries made. Or you could have a global trading system. Remember, the nationally determined contributions, the amount of CO2 that countries commit to reducing, is voluntary. And if you don't make your commitments, you just have a nice meeting, you get some advice. There's no cost to it. So if you have a choice between spending more money after you're transitioning your own industry, you're paying for other people's industries to transition. If it's a choice between spending your own money to buy some CO2 emissions that other countries have reduced, or just not making it at all, why would you do that? And in fact, some countries, possibly China and the United States, when they make their nationally determined contributions, they haven't been following the rules of it has to be the most ambitious you can imagine because we're in a really serious situation. They just commit to reducing CO2 that they know they're going to reduce anyways. It's in line with policies. There's no risk. It's not very good, really, is it? So, what have we got? Mitigation and adaptation. Maybe that's got the best hope of survival. If national governments are prepared to underwrite the risks to the wealthy so they don't lose any money. Loss and damage. Coping with extreme weather events just seems an impossible prediction no matter how much money you've got. The carbon trading, I wouldn't bother if I was you. I'd keep my money for other things. So, this is the question then. If you're a developing country, if you're a country with fossil fuel reserves, you want to carry on selling it, possibly Russia even, are you going to want to stay with the United Nations scheme, the Paris 2015 agreement, that until recently everyone in the world was thinking about, there were no alternatives? Or are you going to go to the new American scheme? Remember, when in the past, when there have been negotiations between the rich and the poor countries, if the rich countries aren't prepared to pay the poor countries the money they need, well, it's tough. Now the poor countries have got some leverage. They can say, if you don't pay the $6 trillion each year, we're going to join the American scheme, and they will give us foreign aid, or they will buy our fossil fuels, and we shall be rich for as long as we can and before the world ends. Have you noticed something? At the beginning of the video, it was all Donald Trump this and Donald Trump that. But look how many people would need to cooperate with him for his plan to succeed. The state governors, the people who work in the United States energy sector, the United Nations, European Union, Britain, China, the developing world. If Donald Trump's plan succeeds for the United States to dominate the world global energy market with fossil fuels, it won't be because he's done so well. It will be because we have done so badly. So it's down to us. Don't be gloomy, it's down to us. There's still hope. I think we should make that the channel motto. There's still hope. There's still hope. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.